Good afternoon and welcome to the last session. I'll be continuing talking about cybercrime. The previous two talks before lunch, they kind of motivated this talk. So this talk is about my adventures with cybercriminal tools, and by sharing this adventure with you, I'm hoping that I'll shed some light on some insights for pragmatic defense. So let's jump right in. So exploit kits are prepackaged malicious toolkits that take advantage of vulnerabilities in browsers and their extensions, and their purpose is to spread malware. So my adventure with this cybercriminal toolkits began about 6 years ago with exclusive access to about 40 different families of exploit kits. And with that much access to these exploit kits, of course, you won't find these exploit kits on the mainstream market. For us, we were able to get access to this exploit kit toolkit sources through colleagues that work with law enforcement. So in the underground cybercrime economy, these exploit kits are marketed with the colorful brands that you see on the slide. So over the years, the business model of these exploit kits has evolved from the traditional pay per license model to what we now call exploit kit as a service model. So once these toolkits are deployed in the wild and they are there, here is how they are going to infect victims. So this is a typical exploit kit infection chain, which begins usually with an enticement stage that leverages social engineering or typical drive-by download vectors. And then the victim is silently redirected behind the scenes by leveraging or taking advantage of traffic direction systems so that the purpose of this redirection is to kind of conceal the footprint of the attack. And then we have fingerprinting, which is basically profiling the client for what kind of browser extensions, operating system it is running, and then combining this to compare it against the exploit pool that the exploit kit has, and then pick the right exploit to launch. So the next stage is infection. So once the exploit kit figures out the system, the victim is vulnerable, it picks the right exploit and it launches that exploit, which is basically dropping and executing this payload on the victim machine. It doesn't stop there. Most exploit kit infections usually have this last stage where they call back home and say, hey, I'm on this machine, I got access to it, what do you want me to do next? This kind of creates a stepping stone for doing further exploits later. Okay, so as a defender, a more realistic question that people should ask is, okay, this exploit kits have a lot of information, but in this broader sense of cybercrime analysis, what is the best strategy to follow to take advantage of this exploit kit intelligence and improve the state of defense? So the state of defense, whenever somebody advises you about the state of defense, they say, oh, you don't have to be reactive all the time, you gotta be proactive. So that's a very common defense advice you get from people in industry or in other places. Okay, fair enough. Here is a different take on that advice. So advice 1.0 says you have to be proactive, and this talk is saying you have to be pragmatic. So to meaningfully improve the state of defense in the cybercrime arms race, well, it's good to be proactive, but I argue that it is great to be pragmatic. So what do I really mean by that? So what I mean by that is you can intelligently combine reactive, proactive, and offensive strategies for what I call pragmatic defense. So why is this something that makes sense? Well, these three seemingly disjoint or different strategies can actually coexist in practice, and they are neither mutually exclusive nor opposing forces when you apply them in practice. So the next question people might ask is, okay, is this really a thing? Is this something that we can do practically? Well, to illustrate advice point 2.0, which is don't be just proactive, you can be pragmatic. So to illustrate that, let's zoom in on my adventures with exploit kits. So the first part I'm going to talk about is this work of probing exploit kits to extract what we call behavioral fingerprints. Okay? So how do we do this? So basically, we deploy these exploit kits because I told you that we have access to about 40 different families of exploit kits. So you can deploy them and play with them and see what happens. So we did exactly that in a controlled environment, of course. And the two goals we had for this are, first, we want to understand the common behavior across these 40 different families, and also the unique fingerprints of the different families we have. And the second goal, of course, which is a follow-up of the first one, is once we know something about these exploit kits, collectively or individually, we want to actively probe and identify these exploit kits in the wild. Okay, so with that goal in mind, we did our analysis in a controlled environment. We deployed Honey clients that interact with these exploit kits. We also used humans to interact with these exploit kits. We combined the insights, and we found out interesting behaviors that exploit kits exhibit, specifically attack-centric behaviors and also self-defense behaviors. So for example, almost all of them do fingerprinting. That happens to be the core stage or phase of the exploit kit infection chain. There is redirection chain. There is obfuscation of exploits across the board. And there is even a case where an exploit kit allows the kit administrator to bring their own exploits, basically extending the exploit pool, custom exploits. And on the other side, as much as they do attack, they also want to stay under the radar of standard protection mechanisms like AVs and IDSs and so on. They have some mechanisms for protecting themselves. For example, they block robots like Google bots and so on. They look up their own URL in blacklists so that they change it. They look at signatures of AV engines and try to create a different variant of themselves. And sometimes they also use this confusing ways of responding to humans versus bots. So the defense capability that we were able to distill from this kind of experience is basically we were able to build a system that can probe live exploit kit URLs and identify the family of these exploit kits with respect to the 40 families we have in store. So some of the intriguing findings that we came across are, for example, within a span of 5 months, we were able to actively probe and identify about 1,100 exploit kits, which were live and kicking at that point. So the lesson that we learned from this kind of analysis is basically by combining the reactive strategy, which is observing what these exploit kits have done after we deployed them, and using that for actively probing them in the wild, we were able to combine proactive and reactive strategies. So as you can see, I'm building up to the Venn diagram of the 3 circles: reactive, proactive, and offensive. So I'm done with the 2 of them. So, but remember that we have also access to the source code, and we didn't really look into the source code in the traditional white box setting. So that's another angle that we wanted to explore. So let me talk about that to complete the whole circle here. So here what we did was to kind of build an infiltration framework that relies on white box source code analysis to identify vulnerabilities, using these vulnerabilities to build real exploits that we can use as weapons to target and infiltrate these exploit kits that we find in the wild. Okay, so the whole motivation we have is, since most of the exploit kits that we analyzed have non-obfuscated source code, this is a low-hanging fruit for doing white box analysis and using the results of the vulnerability analysis to build exploit kits in automated manner. The end goal here is to build a counteroffensive strategy backed by legal authorization, because you cannot arbitrarily apply this to any website. You should have that legal backing to use this kind of toolkit. So the challenges we faced over there, well, if you're familiar with white box vulnerability analysis or source code analysis in general, these systems tend to have false positives. Therefore, we have to narrow down the large number of vulnerabilities into exploitable ones and deploy this as real exploits or concrete exploits. And we have to do this in an automated manner. So these are the challenges we had to navigate to get there. Okay, so you might wonder, who will be using such a strategy or such a toolkit, and for what purpose? Well, there are real use cases for this, real motivations and real interest from the law enforcement community to do things like takedown of botnets or gathering intelligence about this criminal toolkits, or simply searching and fingerprinting toolkits so that we reinforce defense, or even sometimes, if you cannot do all of the three I just mentioned, you can simply interact with the exploit kit and confuse it by feeding it some garbage data. So the defense capability that we were able to distill from this counteroffensive approach is we were able to do things like hijacking the back end of the exploit kit, corrupting the infection statistics, so basically showing garbage on the dashboard of the exploit kit administrator, or stealing configurations and changing them, or even deleting critical files that are useful for the proper functioning of the exploit kit. So in this process, we were able to build about 10 concrete exploits over 6 different exploit kit families. So again, you may wonder, how complex is an exploit? So after you do what I just told you so far, the kind of exploits that we built are the ones you look on the right side of the screen for doing, for example, hijacking the exploit kit database or wipe out exploit kit installation. And I'm by no means assuming that you're reading everything in here, and that's not the point of bringing this up. But the point I'm trying to make here is it's about 15 lines of code on average for writing an exploit for a specific exploit target or exploit kit target. So the lesson we learn from this part is, okay, with legal authorization, that's a very important thing here because, as I said earlier, you cannot really arbitrarily launch this kind of attacks to target other legitimate websites or individuals. So with this legal backing and automation, what you can do is defenders can deter or slow down damages done by exploit kits or potentially stop exploit kits. So circling back to the question I asked at the beginning, this holistic question of, in the cybercrime arms race, how do we improve the state of defense? Well, when I told you about the controlled probing of exploit kits, I was talking about the reactive strategy because the characterization was built after the fact. When I talked about the live probing, I was simply pointing to the proactive component. And just before this slide, I was talking about the counteroffensive strategy, which is the offensive component. So that kind of completes the whole picture of what I call the pragmatic defense. So these strategies, as I told you, instead of competing against each other, they can reinforce each other, they can coexist, they can be useful. So hoping that I convinced you on the synergy between this reactive, offensive, and proactive defense, I will leave you with these two takeaways. The first one, just like us, the defenders, the cybercriminals have a lot of blind spots when they do coding, configuration, or deployment of exploit kits. So we can take advantage of, as defenders, we can take advantage of this exploit kit vulnerabilities and blind spots and build pragmatic defense to turn the table on the cybercriminals. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.